We have our next speakers lined up. We've got Tarik Saleh, who is a senior security engineer and malware researcher, and Chad Anderson, who is a senior security researcher, both for domain tools. So we're going to go ahead and turn things over to those guys. I appreciate it.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Discovering CovidLock. I'm Chad Anderson, Senior Security Researcher at Domain Tools, and with me is Tarik Saleh, our Senior Security Engineer and Malware Researcher. We're going to talk to you a little bit today about the Android ransomware that we discovered, leveraging coronavirus lures to pull people in. But before we do that, we'd like to give a shout out to all the folks at all the talks for having this event and organizing everything and having us here today. We really appreciate being here. With that, we'll go ahead and jump on in. So, when we started to see a lot more coronavirus-related domains registered in January and February, we threw them into our product we call Fisheye. It's a kind of like a really souped-up version of DNS Twist, and it lets us monitor a lot of different terms. We quickly realized that there were massive amounts of domains being registered each day, and more than any researcher could really manage to investigate on their own. So most of them turned out to be simple Amazon affiliate links or, websites that were just parking pages. But we kind of decided that we needed a way to prioritize and, that queue, and we needed to develop a way to do that quickly if we were going to find any sort of interesting domains in this. So what we did is just made some simple prioritization heuristics for this. We took all domains that were on ASNs that are known for parking domains or Shopify, which is a lot of small time scams. We ignored all domains that have multiple A records in DNS, since a lot of malicious infrastructure, rarely do they set up that kind of redundancy, typically OVH or DigitalOcean, something along those lines. We ignored all domains that didn't have any passive DNS entries and far-side passive DNS. That shows they hadn't been weaponized or anything yet, so that let a lot of things fall off for us. And then bubbled up a lot of domains that are from known gray area registrars and name servers like Nyala. If you're aware of doing any hunting, there's always some sort of maliciousness registered on that name server every day, and there's several others out there that are just known for that. And then prioritize any domains that are on high potential for badness hosting providers like OVH. There's just several out there for that. Once we prioritized those, we wrote a little script that did the following. It took all the domains and sorted them by risk score. That's our risk score internally is something that our data science team builds and applies a different machine learning models to all these domains to determine, based upon their age, infrastructure, where they are in the world, whether or not they're riskier or not. And once sorted by that, we queued them all up for a scan on urlscan.io to grab the full DOM screenshot and everything from their API. Big shout out to the folks over at URLscan. I'm looking forward to when they go to their premium service here in this next year. So after that, we pulled a scan after completion and quickly looked over all those screenshots on the page. Just a real quick, loaded up a quick script to make an HTML document that you could just view in the browser. Tons of little screenshots. Scroll through as quick as we could, and then pulled a wget archive of any of the pages that had anything interesting on there, and then further dug into passive DNS to see if it was malicious, what people were setting up, and if it was interesting beyond being, say, a phishing kit or just some, spam email or something like that. So that was when we came across this site that had a map that I'd seen elsewhere developed by an independent developer on Reddit. He'd posted this map, and I thought it was an interesting way to display all the information, since the ones I'd seen so far were kind of clunky. And on that page was an iframe that embedded the map page, the original, but at the top, you'll notice there it asked you to install an Android APK that looked a little suspicious to me. Immediately I pulled that down and sent it over to Tarik, who was able to start taking a look. But before we go into his analysis there, I do want to say that due to this proactive hunting, we found this before a single victim, and within hours of this page coming online. Just being able to see with our tool every single domain that's registered, it just allows us to hop on them a lot quicker. So we were able to find this, before any victims. Diving a little bit deeper, we found that on this site, there's all the privacy information from, or all the information from GDPR is, obfuscated for privacy reasons, but that doesn't quite matter as much with how many other data points there are out there and how easy it is, say, to use a tool like Census, like you can see here. Through that certificate it's a Let's Encrypt certificate, and we're able to see that that key was also matched to other domains. The one that was on there, we ended up throwing into our Iris Investigate tool, which lets us to look at several domains and their properties that, how they're all interconnected. And that kind of led to historical whois, which had additional information, revealed the address for rolling8dice@gmail.com, which had about 154 other previous domains, mostly relating to sex scams and fan guides that came through there. And you can kind of see our risk score on the right. It rated most of those as pretty bad, but 100 would be a blacklist. All the ones below that are not on actual blacklists. So searching across the internet, though, for all these domains, we were able to find this scammer had a history of posting these with explicit images on different subreddits on Reddit, and in an attempt to garner traffic to their other sites, which also in the past contained malicious either pornography or dating and sex Android APKs. So from there, we were able to go and pull all of this extra infrastructure, and we were able to find one of these sites had an open directory, which allowed us to pull down all the artifacts and other files that they had uploaded. And this led to enough data to tie them to several other domains that would lead to attribution. Notice the update times here. These directories were being frequently modified, and we were able to see that based upon this open directory. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Tarik here, who's going to talk a little bit more about the malware and how it works.
Perfect. Hey, thanks, Chad. So yeah, like Chad mentioned, I'm going to talk about what I noticed and discovered with CovidLock from a malware analysis perspective. So we're going to take a look at some of the static and behavioral analysis, and then I want to dive into some details around the ransom payments, a little bit of deep dive in there too. Next slide. So as a bit of a background, Android APK files are really nothing more than just a zip file containing resources and assembled Java code. So if you were to unzip an APK, you'd be left with file types called dex files, among other things, which are just inflated compiled resources, not necessarily human readable. So the APK tool is a really first step that I think anybody handling Android malware analysis should do. And that's kind of what I did in this case. So when beginning the dig into CovidLock, this is the beginning stages of static analysis. Go ahead, next slide. And now that we've decoded CovidLock and converted a lot of those dex files into a human readable Java code, I began to analyze CovidLock's resources to understand how it operates. And really the goal is to understand the capabilities, how it operates, and extract any noteworthy IoCs. And let's go on to the next slide. For those of you that have done malware analysis on Android devices, you'd be familiar with what a manifest is. For others, to help level set, all APKs contain a manifest file which provides information to the Android operating system on how to handle this application. There are several data fields inside of a manifest that are interesting, but specifically the ones that I always start digging into first are the requested permissions, which you can see some of the output on the screen there. Analyzing the manifest can tell me what permissions CovidLock is requesting against Android's APIs. And doing this kind of permission analysis tells me a lot of things as a malware researcher. This really helps me understand how CovidLock does its privilege escalation, its persistence mechanism, and really other important capabilities too. This also tells me what CovidLock generally does not do. We don't see any permissions to SMS or contact information or reading external storage APIs. So this kind of tells us a little bit about what CovidLock can't do. Next slide. So let's talk about CovidLock's persistence mechanism. CovidLock uses the Android feature boot completed, which is a permission to establish its persistence on victims' phones. For those of you that are more familiar with Windows-based threats, this is really similar to operationally speaking, how the Windows registry run keys used as a persistence mechanism operate, or even a Windows service that runs malware in the background upon reboot. There are some other really noteworthy Android-based threats that also leverage this, such as Pegasus, SpyNote, and FlexiSpy. So this is actually a really common persistence mechanism that we see in Android malware. And let's go to the next slide. So we were able to determine rather quickly how CovidLock maintains its persistence on victims' phones. We can also see this manifest itself when we run CovidLock and do dynamic analysis of it in a virtual environment, which you can see on the screen up above. But the bind device admin, this was a previous permission requested by CovidLock. We saw that in the manifest file. What this does is this allows access to the administrator API of Android, which and also allows CovidLock to really do what it does best and become ransomware by locking out your screen. And here's how we determined what CovidLock does. We could see the API calls being made above there to the lock screen API, as well as resetting the PIN number for the phone, which is done by the set storage encryption functionality. And let's go to the next slide. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I did want to kind of show how CovidLock, here's some of the decoded code from CovidLock, highlighting how it checks for if the user is an administrator on the phone or not. And let's move on to the next slide. And what we see here, here's how CovidLock presents itself to the victim upon app launch. The CovidLock malware author did a really good job of preying on people's fear of the coronavirus. Here, CovidLock states that if you want to see if there's any coronavirus infected people in your area, to click activate or to click grant to see the coronavirus stats. But in reality, clicking those buttons are what actually activates those API calls that we looked at earlier, accessing those administrator permissions and thus beginning CovidLock's encryption and ransom routine. Let's move on to the next slide. If you've ever reverse engineered a malware sample that involves encryption, specifically with ransomware, one of the biggest things to look out for is how the encryption keys are generated and where they're stored at. In this case, CovidLock's author didn't go beyond statically embedding the decryption key, which we released publicly on Domain Tools' blog, to help mitigate any damages this attacker may have caused. Some can call this sloppy from a malware development perspective, but it's really important to keep in mind, and Chad mentioned this earlier, this doesn't impede CovidLock from being effective at locking out people's devices. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the network operations of CovidLock. So CovidLock made a lot of standard benign DNS requests, mainly to Google services, but on dynamic analysis, I did notice one anomaly, which was a query to a bit.ly URL shortening service. Let's move to the next slide. Following the trail, I was able to uncover CovidLock's ransomware note, which is dynamically generated and pulled from those bit.ly URL shortening services, which ended up redirecting the victim to a specific pastebin paste site. This is also important to note because the attacker has the ability to modify two components of CovidLock on the fly to change IoCs like the email address or the Bitcoin wallet. Let's move to the next slide. And what we see here is part of the actual ransom note that gets displayed on victims' lock screens. What was interesting is that the CovidLock author statically embedded but dynamically called this ransom note. And there's several pieces of this ransom note that are pulled together dynamically as well, some from pastebin, some that are statically stored. But it's important to note that the attacker claims, you can see at the very bottom there, the attacker claims to monitor your GPS, but we previously saw in the Android manifest and other API calls that that's actually a false claim. But this kind of speaks to the sophistication of social engineering and luring and phishing that the CovidLock author is going to get victims to actually pay the ransom. And let's move to the next slide. And so on the left-hand side is what you can see when CovidLock successfully executes and locks out the user after approximately 60 seconds after being run. The ransom note content is both statically and dynamically called. There's a little bit of unintuitiveness with CovidLock. In order to actually see the Bitcoin wallet ID and the attacker's email address, you have to click that web designist button. So not that intuitive. I'm not going to make any comments about the anonymous logo, but it is up there for everybody to see. And let's move on to the next slide. So tracking some of the financial operations of CovidLock, we're keeping an eye on CovidLock's wallets, Bitcoin wallets. There's only been 2 transactions as of today to the wallet, which is good, because the transaction values are approximately under $3 in total. So this is likely canary transactions of some sorts and not actual ransom victim payments. My theory is that with the publication of the decryption keys and the traction of the CovidLock in the media really led to the domain being blacklisted really quickly, being propagated inside of Google Safe Browsing List, and the CovidLock APK being submitted to Google Play Protect. The APK was flagged relatively quickly, in fact, in a matter of days, being published to Google Play Protect. So I think all those factors combined really helped us mitigate CovidLock's from being a lot more successful than it could have been. Let's go to the next slide. So CovidLock wasn't necessarily an APT sophisticated threat, but it really highlights how effective Android ransomware can be. One of the big callouts about CovidLock is its impact to the end user, or the victims in this case. If someone does not have access to their bank accounts or their mobile device when in a quarantine, they can't make phone calls, they likely can't order food, they can't even check their bank statements or any of their medical information. So CovidLock had the potential to really prey on victims that are extremely vulnerable during this coronavirus pandemic. And thankfully, with all of our efforts, we were able to mitigate any damages that could have been done potentially. And let's move to the next slide. With that, we are open for Q&A.
All right, so let's bring our speakers back in here. So we've got Tarik and Chad, and so yes, if you guys have questions for these gentlemen, please go ahead and ask them in the Q&A panel, which I'm going to pull up here now and see where we're at. Not seeing any new questions there. Let's take a look quick on the Slack side. See, great talk, you guys. Will the slides be available somewhere? And it looks like that actually looks like you guys already answered that. So,
oh, yeah.
So anything you guys want to share real briefly about the work you did here? I mean, this is actually some pretty impressive stuff and some obviously later breaking stuff as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd like to mention. If, as I posted in the Slack channel there, feel free to read the blog that we posted that's a little bit more in depth. And then also, if you're interested in hunting, doing any threat hunting with COVID and coronavirus related domains, we are releasing a list on our website of all the domains that we find newly registered each day from a number of terms and their permutations, all related to the coronavirus. And so it would be awesome if you want to assist in helping to track down maliciousness. That's a decent place to start, and go to domaintools.com for that.
Very cool.
And we have some published IoCs in the blog post that Chad linked that if any threat intelligence researchers want to keep expanding on any investigations with that and would be happy to share their data with us, we'd be more than happy to work with you on that.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you guys for a great talk. Really appreciate it. And you guys will be around, I assume, in Slack for a little while that people can address questions to you there as well.
Absolutely.
Yep, we'll be hanging out.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Everybody. All right, so folks, we will go ahead. We're going to take a short break here.